Hey everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we'll be discussing the basics about firewalls. Now in terms of definition, firewall is basically a network security system that monitors and controls incoming and outgoing network traffic based on a predetermined security rules. Now we'll be understanding this specific pointer in more detail in a moment, but just remember that when it comes to firewall, there are both hardware as well as software based firewalls that you will find. So now let's understand more about firewalls in an easy to understand manner. Now this diagram here, it basically depicts the internet. Now in internet you will see that there are both genuine users and you will also have bad guys which are termed as a hackers. Now whenever you create a server and that server is linked to the internet, that might mean that both the good guys as well as the bad guys will be able to connect to it. So in this diagram, on the top you have a good guy and on the bottom you have the bad guy. So what you want is you want good guys to be able to connect. However, you do not really want the bad guys to be able to connect to your server that you have created. So what you can do is you can introduce a security component called as firewall. So in the previous diagram, if you will see, there was no firewall. So everyone would be able to connect to your server which you have created on the internet. But as a security measure, you have added a firewall. So in this firewall, you can go ahead and you can configure some security rules. So at a high level overview, the security rules would say, allow the connections from trusted network and block the connections from untrusted network, or you can say block the connection from hackers. So now what will happen is anyone who tries to connect to the server, they will have to first go through the firewall, and firewall will check its own rules, and depending upon the rules that are configured in the firewall, it will either allow the connection or it will block the connection. So let's really look into how it would do that. So let's say that you have a Linux server that has been created and there is a firewall on front of it. Now in a Linux server, there can be multiple processes which would be listening. So let's say that there is a web server like Apache or Nginx which is listening on port 80. Then you might have SSH which might be listening on port 22. You might have FTP which might be listening on 21 and so on. So there can be n number of processes and each processes might be listening on a specific port. Now, if you look into this rule here, this is basically the firewall rule here. So in this firewall rule, what we are telling is anyone who is connecting to port 22. So if you will see, port 22 is associated with SSH and the source. So here you are giving the IP address. So it says that anyone connecting to port 22 and that person has the IP address which is defined over here, allow that connection. So in this diagram, this good guy over here, whenever he performs the SSH towards this server A, and since he has the IP address 10.0.557, which is the same that you see in the screenshot, his connection will be allowed through the firewall. That means he'll be able to connect to the server. However, on the contrary, whenever a bad guy tries to connect to the server, his connection will be blocked, because if you see his IP address, it is 112.20.50.60. Since his IP address is not allowed within the firewall rules, his connection will be blocked whenever he tries to connect to the server. So this functionality of accepting the connection or blocking the connection is the responsibility of a firewall. Now, depending upon the cloud provider that you choose, the name of firewall changes. So let's say that if you're using a Linux system, then it is called as the IP tables, which is basically the software based firewalls. Now when you talk about AWS, then it is called as the security groups. You also have network ACLs, which are also kind of firewalls which are available in AWS. Great. So that's the overview about firewalls. Let's do one thing. Let's do some experimenting so that we can understand this in a fun way. Now I have a simple EC2 instance running over here, And this EC2 instance, if you look into the security group, there are two security group allowed. One is for port 80 and second is for port 22. So that basically means that anyone who is trying to connect to port 80 and port 22 will be allowed to connect to the server. Now, one of the important section here is the source. So source here is 0.0.0.0. That basically means allow anyone. So anyone who is sitting on the internet, maybe in the remote location somewhere in the jungle, he'll be able to connect it to your server. Alright, so let's do one thing. Let me go ahead and copy the IP address of my server, and I'll make use of a utility called as Telnet for our demonstration purpose. And I'll paste the IP address and I'll add a port of 80. So here it says connected. So Telnet is generally used to verify if you're able to connect to a specific port or not. So as we were discussing that in a server, there can be multiple processes like Nginx, Apache, SSH, etc. that would be running. So if you want to verify, if this guy wants to verify quickly if he is able to connect to the server on a specific port, he can make use of a Telnet utility. Alright, so the reason why it says connected is because the firewall is not blocking it. Now let's go ahead and modify the firewall rule. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll go ahead and remove the firewall rule completely. So now we only have the firewall rule allowed for 22. So now when you try to connect on port 80 again, you will see it is only trying. It is not really able to connect to the port. This is because the firewall is blocking it. So in a similar way, when you change the port 80 to port 22, you will see that I am connected now, primarily because this firewall, which is also called as the security group in AWS, is allowing the connection. Great. So I hope you understood the basics of firewall. Now few important part to remember. First part to remember is that on port 22 you should never allow this. The reason is because the 22 port is primarily used to connect to the server, and if you allow the entire internet to connect to your server, then after some amount of time you will see that your server is hacked. And in so many organizations that I consult with, lot of organizations, they make similar mistakes here due to which they get breached. So always remember, never allow 0000 on port 22 or maybe even on some critical ports unless absolute necessary. So the question is, what should we allow? So let's say that I have my server. So this is my server, and what I want is only I should be able to connect. No one else except me should be able to connect. So what you need to do, you have to first find the IP address that your ISP has assigned to you, and then whitelist that IP address within here. So let's look into how we can find that. Now within Google, when you say what's my IP, it will automatically show you the IP address that your ISP has assigned to you. Or you can even open up some other websites, and all of them will typically show you the same IP address, which is 36.2.101, and the same is being displayed over here. So this is the IP address that you have been assigned. So let's copy this up, and instead of allowing everyone to connect to your port 22, what you can do is you can replace this with your IP address followed by /32. Now for now you do not really need to worry what /32 means, but in a simple way, /32 basically denotes that this number that you have added is basically a single IP. So now you can go ahead and click on save over here. So this firewall rule that we have created is much more secure rule, because no one in the internet will be able to connect to your server except the one who has this specific IP address. So let's do the same thing for port 80 here. So even for port 80, instead of this 0000, I'll just add my IP address here. Great. So let's clear the screen, and now when you try to connect to port 80, you see we are able to successfully connect to our server in a secured fashion. So coming back to our PPT, as we were discussing in the first slide, you can have both hardware as well as software based firewalls. So here you have a security group which you are able to quickly configure. Now, when you talk about software based firewalls, in Linux, there are certain tools through which you can also configure the firewall rules. Now let me quickly show you. So I am currently connected to my Linux box, and currently if I do a IP tables -L, you will see that this basically shows you the firewall rules. Now since it is currently empty, that basically means that no firewall rules have been configured, but you can even configure firewall rules at a Linux level. Now ultimately the logic remains the same. Basically in AWS it becomes much more simpler because this is a GUI and you can just with a click of button you can configure your firewall rules. But when it comes to Linux, you will have to make use of certain CLI commands to configure the rules within the firewall. Great. So I hope you understood the basic concept of firewall. Now before we conclude, let me show you one interesting thing. Now the firewall not only controls who can connect to the server, but the firewall can also control whom the server can connect to outbound. So let's say that you have a server and this server is trying to connect to google.com. So you might want to allow that. But if this firewall is trying to connect to a website called as virus.com, then you might want to block that specific IP address associated with that domain. So that can also be achieved with the help of firewall. Let me in fact show you that. Now in the first pointer, if you will see, we already discussed that firewall can control both. This is the incoming and outgoing. So till now we were discussing about the incoming traffic, but firewall can also control the outgoing traffic. Let's look into it. So in the security group that we have, there were two options. One was inbound and second was outbound. Now if you look into the outbound rule, by default it is allowing to connect to all the destinations over here. So let's do one thing. Let's alter this also so that our concept is clear. So before we do that, let's go ahead and do a ping on google.com, and you are able to see you are getting successful replies. Now let's go ahead and change this so that the server cannot connect anywhere outbound. So let me close it and let's go ahead and ping google.com again, and now you will see that it is not able to connect to google.com. As soon as we changed this specific destination, all the packets which were destined to go outbound were blocked completely. So currently if you see, there was a 100% packet loss. Now again, if you will change it to 0.0.0.0, let's change it again and let's try to ping. You see it is working perfectly well. Great. So I hope with this video you understood the basics of what firewalls are all about. I hope this video has been informative for you and I look forward to see you in the next video.